So we're just sitting there, and everything that the enemy fires at Charlie Company that doesn't take effect sweeps through where we are. And I'm flat on my belly, just feathering out at the edges and cursing my buttons and zippers for putting me that much higher in the air. And I feel a thump in my ribs, and I think, oh my God, am I hit? And I very carefully turn my head to see what it is, and what it is a size 12 combat boot on the foot of Sergeant Major Plei Me. And he bends at the waist and hollers at me, "Can't take no pictures laying there on the ground, sonny." I thought, you know, he's right. Later I would learn sergeants major are always right. But he's not only right, but I think we may all die here today. I was born in Bryan, Texas, 3 weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. My dad was doing a course at Texas A&M at the time, and I really didn't see him or to know him until the end of the war, and late in 1945 when he finally came home. He and 5 of his brothers and 4 of my mother's brothers were all in uniform during that war. So I kind of grew up in houses full of frightened women who were looking out the window for the telegraph boy. I started watching the Vietnam developments in 1963, reading stories on the wire from David Halberstam of the New York Times, and Neil Sheehan of UPI, and Malcolm Brown of the AP. And I thought, well, it looks like that may be my generation's war, and if it comes to pass, I want to cover it. So I started pushing my bosses, begging, pleading, threatening to get transferred to Asia, to get in position where I could get in on covering that war early on. And right after the 1964 elections in November, I got a call from my boss saying, you know, do you have a trench coat? And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, no. And he said, well, you better get one because you've just been transferred to Tokyo. And at that time, I was working as the State House correspondent in Topeka, Kansas. So it was a jump from Topeka to Tokyo in one foul swoop. And when I got to Tokyo, I went in for my interview with the boss, and I said, you know, I want to go to Vietnam. And he said, I just sent a second reporter to Saigon. We're never going to need any more than that. And I just sort of thought, well, hide and watch. And that was in November of '64. The Marines landed in Da Nang in March of '65, and I landed there in April of '65. So I got in early. I thought, I gotta hurry. The Marines have landed. This is going to be over with quick. And it took me about all of a week to figure out that it wasn't going to be over with in a week, that there was going to be enough and plenty war for everybody, and it might outlast me.
Did you have any close calls or have trouble adjusting to life in Vietnam?
No, not really. I had wanted to get there. I volunteered. I begged and pleaded to get there, and now I was there. I was doing what I wanted to do. I was out in the field with the troops and filing stories and shooting pictures, and I was happy as a clam. And I did not get into any major fights until I moved up to the Central Highlands after about 6 months. Come October, well, I'd actually had a little thing in August of '65 I was flying that milk run from Saigon back to Da Nang, and it stopped in Pleiku, and they dropped the tail to offload mail bags and load on a few people. And I looked out there, and I saw them tossing bodies off a helicopter, ARVN, South Vietnamese bodies. And I just grabbed my pack and jumped off, and I went around and found me an American and said, "What the hell's going on?" And they said, "Oh, big fight out at Duco Special Forces camp, and they're getting up a relief crew to go out. The South Vietnamese paratroopers are marching out of there back toward here, and we're going to meet them." And so I hooked up on that. And they had a couple of tanks and some armored personnel carriers, and we went out about 15 miles and met these guys who had walked back through the jungle from the fighting at Duco. And I met their advisor, who was a brand new major named Norm Schwarzkopf. He would later proved to be a very good friend and good acquaintance to have during the Gulf War. But that was a little bit of excitement there. And I eventually went on to Da Nang, but that had caught my eye. The Central Highlands is not so much rice paddy country. It's up in the mountains. It's cooler. And so I talked the boss into letting me come back there along about early October and 65. And I was, just around learning the ground and talking to Americans. And middle of the month, I heard that a big fight had started. A North Vietnamese regiment was surrounding the Special Forces camp at Plei Me, which is about 30 miles from Pleiku and out near the border with Cambodia. And I wanted to get there. And I found that nobody was flying out that way. They had closed the airspace. They had shot down 2 fighter bombers and 2 Huey Army helicopters. And I was stomping up and down the flight line, grumbling. And a Texas helicopter pilot buddy of mine, Ray Burns from Grenada, Texas, come by and said, "Oh, what's up, Joe?" And I said, "Oh, I want to get out to this Special Forces camp and I can't get a ride." He said, "Well, that's because they closed the airspace." And I said, "I know that, dummy. I want to go anyway." And he said, "I'd like to get a look at it myself, so I'll give you a ride." And the Texans are crazy anyway. And so he flew me out there, sure as anything, and I have a picture I shot out of the open door of this Huey, laying on its side, sort of doing a swivel down to the camp. And the camp fills that doorway, and I can see there are 10 puffs of white smoke where mortar rounds from the enemy are landing, and that's where we're going. And we landed, and I jumped out, and they threw 3 or 4 wounded Montagnard tribesmen on board, and my buddy's gone, shooting me the bird through the plexiglass. And Special Forces Master Sergeant runs up. He says, "Sir," he said, "I don't know who you are, but Major Beckwith wants to see you right away, the camp commander." I said, "Which one is he?" He says, "It's that big guy over there jumping up and down on his hat." And so I went over, and there was Sergeant Charlie Beckwith, a legendary figure who would later found the Delta Force. And Charlie is just beside himself. He said, "Who the hell are you?" I said, "I'm a reporter." He said, he said, "I need everything in the world." He said, "I need medevac, I need food, I need ammo. I'd love to have a bottle of Jim Beam and a box of cigars, and what has the Army sent me in its wisdom but a godforsaken reporter?" And I was feeling a little down at this, and he says, "Well," he said, "son," I got news for you. I don't have a vacancy for a reporter, but I desperately need a corner machine gunner, and you're it." Well, my ride's going over the mountain. There's nothing I can do but say, "Yes, sir." And he gave me about a 10-minute get-rich-quick course on the loading and the clearing of jams with the 30 caliber air-cooled machine gun, light machine gun. And he told me, he said, "You shoot the little brown men outside the wire, not the ones inside. They belong to me." And he said, "One more thing. You see that bunker down there?" He said, "It's manned by South Vietnamese, and I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. So you keep a constant eye on them too. And if they turn the gun around and start shooting into us, you take them out." Yes, sir. 3 days and 3 nights I was on that machine gun. And, we were being resupplied by airdrops, some of which landed out for the enemy's benefit, and some which landed, there was such a good shot that it landed right in the middle of the camp and smushed these pallets loaded with stuff, smashed the buildings in the camp. And eventually along came a South Vietnamese armored column. The whole purpose of this had been to besiege us, to draw this armored column out of Plei Me down a dirt road and ambush them and kill them off and then finish us off. Well, it would have worked. It was standard tactics. The South Vietnamese fell for it every time. But this time, the South Vietnamese commander wouldn't commit the troops to the rescue unless the Americans provided artillery cover. And the 1st Cavalry Division had just come into country. They had 435 helicopters on their inventory. And they said, "Sure, we'll airlift the 105 howitzers and just jump them from point to point alongside, so they're covering this convoy." And when they snapped the ambush, the artillery and the air support just ate them alive. And so the people who were surrounding us decided discretion was the better part of valor, and they left. And the armor column came in, the cavalry battalion landed from its helicopters, and they were to sweep the mountains around the hills around the camp. And so I went to Major Beckwith and said my goodbyes, and he allowed as how I'd done a reasonable job on the machine gun, and he said, "You're not carrying a piece." And I said, "Well, technically speaking, in spite of the use you have made of me these last 3 days, I'm a civilian non-combatant." And he looked at me and said, "There ain't no such thing in these mountains, son. Sergeant Major, get him an M16 and a bag of magazines." And so I marched out of there with a rifle and a sack full of loaded magazines and off with the Cav to sweep those hills. And they had about 10 or 12 .51 caliber Chinese-made anti-aircraft machine guns mounted around this camp. And the air attacks had It just, killed all the vegetation, shattered the trees, looked like a moonscape up there. And we found these machine guns, some of them with the gunner's leg chained to the tripod under the machine gun. They were, later I talked to the North Vietnamese commander and said, "Why'd you do that?" He said, "Well, they were green troops, and we weren't sure they'd be able to stand up under the air attacks. So we chained them to the guns so they couldn't run." And they died on those guns. But that was getting down to serious war there. After this little adventure with Major Beckwith in Plei Me camp, I messed around a bit, and I went on early November. The Cav came out and started running major operations, and I hooked up with them. I hooked up with the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. A guy named Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore was commanding. And they were going into the mountains east of Plei Me camp. And God, it was awful terrain. Sometimes take an hour to cut your way through the brush and the wait-a-minute vines and all that stuff. It was a long, hot walk in the sun. We did a med cap on a Montagnard village. When we marched into that place, an old man came out of the longhouse that sat up in the air, and he came out. He had found somewhere in his stuff a French flag, and he was pulling on his old French Army tunic. And he thought his old friends had come back finally. And I don't know if he ever figured out that we weren't his French friends. But that's how remote a place that was. We marched on from there and spent the night up in a plateau, about 4,500 feet or something like that. The coldest I've ever been, including 3 years in Moscow. I'd like to have froze to death. We forded a river right before we pulled into this perimeter. So we're all soaking wet, no fire, no cigarettes, just roll up in your poncho and freeze to death. It would stand me in good stead that I did this, though, because 3 days later, that battalion was assigned to go into a clearing at the bottom of a mountain called Chupong in the Ia Drang River Valley, about 17 miles the other side of Plei Me camp. And I wanted to go in on the first lift, and the commander said, no. We don't have but 16 choppers, and they're full. We're going to have to do about 4 lifts to get the battalion in. But if anything happens, I'll give you a ride out there. I said, okay. And sure enough, in 30 minutes' time, they were in a fight for their lives. And the colonel, brigade commander, flew me out there, and we were circling overhead. Easy to find. The smoke was rising 5,000 feet in the air. And he was telling the lieutenant colonel he wanted to land, and Colonel Moore was saying, no, you land that command chopper with all those antenna, they'll shoot it up and you'll have to walk home. So while we were circling, they shot down an A-1E Sky Raider, American Air Force, hit a can of napalm under his belly. And so there was 100 yards of fire and smoke trailing behind him as he went in. And I was over by the door of the chopper on my side. I could see him the whole way. And they were yelling, anybody see a shoot? And I keyed the mic and said, no shoot. He went in with the bird. And he's still there. Captain McClellan. an older Air Force officer, pilot, wife and 5 kids. He still rests in that jungle. They know where he is. They offered the family to recover the remains, but his widow wrote back to them and said, "No, leave him there. He was doing what he loved more than anything else, and he was carrying out a mission in one of the biggest battles of the whole war. So let him rest there in peace and in honor." She said the Air Force took care of me and those kids. All 5 kids got a college degree. So let it be, let him be. Since he couldn't land, though, I got dumped at the artillery fire base, which is about 5 clicks away from the fight. And I was trying to find a ride and not having any luck. And as the day wore on, 5 other reporters and photographers turned up, including my nemesis, Peter Arnett of the AP. And I was just in despair that none of us were going to get there, especially me. And I spotted Colonel Moore's operations officer, a guy named Captain Matt Dillon. I said, "Matt, I need to get in there." And he said, "Well, as soon as it gets dark, I'm taking in 2 Hueys full of ammo. But I can't take you unless the old man says so." I said, "Well, get him on the radio." And I went in the tent with him, and he got on the radio, and you could hear the battle rattling in the background, and he was talking to Moore, and he told him he was bringing ammo and water. And as soon as it got dark, and I'll never forget the answer of the colonel, he said, "If he's crazy enough to want to come in here and you got room, bring him." So all I had to do then was hide out from the other guys until they got tired and went back to Plei Me to, a hot meal and a cold bunk. And I got a ride into the pages of history. I thought I had the world in a jug and a cork in my hand. This is what I'd been looking for 7 months. The biggest battle of the war. The bloodiest battle of the war, and it would remain so throughout the war.
Tell me about where you landed and what was going on as soon as you hit ground.
It was dark, very dark. The moon had not risen. We come sailing in, and as we're coming down, I could see all these little flickering lights coming down the mountain. And for a minute, I wasn't sure whether they were shooting at us with those muzzle flashes, but they were too steady. And I asked Captain Dillon. He said, no, those are little lights, little oil lamps that the North Vietnamese tie to their pack so the guy behind them will follow them in the right trail and they don't get lost moving in the dark. But there were thousands of them, and they were coming for us. So we drop into this tall grass in a clearing and can't see much. I jump out. I start helping them unload ammo and water, just throwing it out of there as fast as we can. And the choppers are gone, and we fall flat. And we're laying there, and I hear a voice in the darkness, "Follow me, and I'll take you to the command post, and watch where you step. There's a lot of bodies in this grass, and they're all American." That's a very sobering wake-up. And it was Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, a bear of a man out of West Virginia, led us to Colonel Moore, and he welcomed us. We talked about the lights on the mountain, and he turned around and told somebody to get some fire on that and burn them up. I sat down with my back to a little tree and my rifle across my knees and my camera likewise, and waited for sunup. But I had an exclusive front row seat at the biggest battle of the war, and for a wire service reporter, there's nothing finer. I was just happy as a clam until about 10 minutes of 7, and it was light, and I was starting to think about cooking me a can of coffee, and about then the bottom fell out of everything. 2 battalions of the enemy attacked the Charlie Company positions on the southeast, and the command post was behind a termite hill, something big like a Volkswagen and like concrete. We couldn't dig any holes around it because it was just like concrete. So we're just sitting there, and everything that the enemy fires at Charlie Company that doesn't take effect sweeps through where we are, at about yay high. And I'm flat on my belly, just feathering out at the edges and cursing my buttons and zippers for putting me that much higher in the air. And I feel a thump in my ribs, and I think, oh my God, am I hit? And I very carefully turn my head to see what it is, and what it is a size 12 combat boot on the foot of Sergeant Major Plumlee. And he bends at the waist and hollers at me, "Can't take no pictures laying there on the ground, sonny." I thought, he's right. Later I would learn sergeants major are always right. But he's not only right, but I think we may all die here today. I mean, this is Custer's old outfit that I'm done hooked up with, and we're in a river valley surrounded by vastly larger numbers of hostiles, just like Custer, and that didn't end very well at all. And I just decided if I'm going to get it, if today is my day to die, then I'll take mine standing up alongside a man like the sergeant major, and like a fool, I got up. And once I got up, the fear, what there was of it, went away. And I was shooting pictures and walking around with him. He went over to the aid station where the battalion surgeon and the medical platoon sergeant, Keaton, were sitting. And he walked up to them, and he pulled out his .45 and jacked a round in, and he said, "Gentlemen, prepare to defend yourselves." And the doctor looked like he had been shot. I mean, whatever he thought he had signed up for, this was not it. And the sergeant major just kept going around putting people on alert. And what it was like me, he thought it was a very good chance we were going to be overrun, and he was getting up a reserve force, such as it was, ash and trash and cooks and one reporter. But we had a very exciting time. I saw men get up and take action that was certain to cause their death, but they would go to rescue a wounded man, and we lost a lot of lieutenants that way. I heard the command given to fix bayonets and saw them used in combat action. We were hit by friendly fire. 2 cans of napalm released coming right at us in the command post. There was another plane loaded right behind him, and Colonel Moore was yelling at Charlie Hastings, the Air Force liaison, "Get that guy off of us, Charlie." He figured we had to eat the first 2 cans, but we didn't need 2 more. And Charlie was screaming in his radio, and that guy pulled off finally. But we still had to deal with those 2 cans. They came right over our heads, and they hit maybe 20 yards less, but they were going away. So the fire thrust was that way. And you felt the heat instantly. And there was an engineer team that had been brought in to cut down trees and open up the landing zone. There were 2 of them caught there in the fire. They were dancing and screaming, and I got up and ran toward it across the clearing. A medic got up and started toward it. He was shot by a sniper and killed. And I pulled a young soldier named Jim Nakayama out of the fire, brought him over to the aid station, but he was in terrible, terrible shape. Had sucked the fire down his lungs, and he was screaming, and the doctor gave him all the morphine in the world, but it didn't make any difference. That boy died 2 days later in an Army hospital, and he had a wife, and she gave birth to a baby girl that week who would never know her dad. I've met them both, sat and talked to them, laughed and cried. They're good friends. Some of that stuff lives with you forever.
Was the napalm any effective at keeping the North Vietnamese out?
Oh yeah, all of it was effective. We had artillery, 2 batteries of 105s. They fired 22,000 rounds of ammo in 3 days. They just built a circle of steel around us. And the Air Force, Navy, Marine fighters, the colonel pulled the rope on it and declared we were in danger of being overrun, and every available aircraft in South Vietnam was diverted to us. They stacked them up at 1,000 feet from 7,000 to 35,000 feet. And they poured on everything, 500-pound bombs, napalm, you name it. And the one thing that I knew is I sure was glad I wasn't a North Vietnamese who had to walk to work through that stuff. And later we would interview the North Vietnamese commanders and some of the guys who were lieutenants at that time commanding companies, and they said, we thought we would all die. We thought nobody can live in that storm of fire, but some of us did. And we were all going to school on the other. They as much as we, or maybe more. They knew how to fight the French. The French were road bound. They couldn't go any faster than a deuce-and-a-half truck, usually a lot slower, maybe the pace of a walking man. But now we've come there, and we have all these helicopters, and we're jumping around all over the battlefield, and we bothered them. They wanted to know, can they handle this? Can their troops succeed in battle with a foe who has everything, has air superiority, can haul artillery within reach in a matter of minutes? All of this we had on our side, and all they had was an AK-47 rifle and some mortars and little rockets. And their commander said, okay. He came up with something he called grab them by the belt buckle. If you can get through the rain of lead and shrapnel and fire, if you can get under that and get in close enough to grab them by the belt buckle, then they have to pull that fire off and then it's just man to man, and we're as good as they are. The third morning, the things were quiet on the battlefield. We had an impression that the enemy was retreating. Colonel Moore ordered everyone to fix bayonets, and he ordered everyone to move the perimeter out 300 meters. And we ran into stay-behinds, snipers tied up in the trees, things like that. Blew them up, killed 30 or 40 more, and then moved on out to the limits that he prescribed. And then his order by radio was turn around, fall to your hands and knees, and crawl back through the high grass and find the 2 missing Americans. He had gotten a good count from the rear as to his dead and wounded, and he knew there were 2 dead men out there. And we found them and brought them back because he wasn't going to leave there without them. The man was, there were certain principles that he was just not going to violate. And there it was. Well, I rode out with Colonel Moore, and we went by the artillery base and thanked them for all their support, keeping us alive, and then flew to Camp Holloway at Plei Me. And Colonel Moore's men, like I, were filthy. The grime, the blood, the smoke was ingrained in us. Our uniforms were ripped and torn and rotten. And everybody got a new uniform and a hot shower, and they were busy having some beers, and the next morning, our sister battalion, who stayed behind in the LZ, marched off to another clearing 3 kilometers away and marched right into an L-shaped ambush. And another 155 American boys were killed in 6 hours' time. Absolute, shootout in the jungle. Like a saloon shootout, if I could say that. So that was a real shock. We thought we had won a victory of sorts at Landing Zone X-Ray, and now comes this with our sister battalion in Landing Zone Albany. And, we were sitting in Holloway, and here came Westmoreland. Got up on the hood of a Jeep and made a bullshit speech to these boys who were sitting there, I don't know thinking what, but I'm sure they weren't very impressed with General Westmoreland's speech. The book really caught fire, first among veterans of the war, and then among those who were curious about the war and how it was fought. The general and I both read history, and we wrote this book because we hadn't seen any book written that simply said thank you to these young men who had given quite a lot in sacrificing for this country. And we wanted, we couldn't write a book that covered it all, but we could cover this battle in such minute detail that every veteran of the war could look at it and say, it makes me feel good again about my service. And if you can do that, if you can change a few lives, and I think we changed more than a few. We got calls from wives saying, my husband came in last month with your book under his arm, and he went into his library and closed the door, and he stayed in there for 2 days. And then he came out and said, I want to tell you all something. Come and sit down. Said the first time he's ever talked about the war. Thank you for giving him back to us. We didn't know who he was.
Was there anything else that you might like to add, or words of advice for future generations who may watch?
Read history. Understand history. Study history so you don't have to repeat it again and again and again.